From the 1950s to the 1980s, Canada investigated and dismissed thousands of people in the military and federal public service on suspicion of being gay. A new TVO original documentary called The Fruit Machine tells the story of that grim period in our history. Joining us now for more, in the nation's capital, John Ibbitson, the writer-at-large for the Globe and Mail. And here in our studio, the director and writer of the documentary, The Fruit Machine, Sarah Fodey, and Patti Gray, a veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces, who is among those featured in the film. And we are delighted to welcome you two here in our studio. John, always great to have you on the program. Thanks for being there for us in the nation's capital. Let us start, as we often do when we discuss documentaries and films on the program, with a clip. If you would, Mr. Director, please.
You couldn't be gay. It was the worst thing that you could be.
The straight out would call me, you're sick in the head, you have a mental illness. This is not normal. You're not a normal person.
Our field investigation has determined that you are a homosexual. How do you respond to this charge?
We were interrogated like prisoners of war. You know, we were thrown in the back of a car, driven to an undisclosed area, interrogated for hours and hours.
My war was within the military, the Canadian Armed Forces.
And I remember telling them in one of the interviews, I said, you can't do this. I said, this is Canada. And he looked me in the eye and he said, we're the military, we can do what we want.
Sarah, the Fruit Machine refers to what?
The Fruit Machine, in its essence, was devised as a scientific tool to detect homosexuality in the 1960s in Canada.
It was a real thing, a real scientific tool?
I'm not sure how scientific it was,
No
but
kidding.
it was real.
The word fruit, obviously, is a derogatory term for gay people. No
Yes.
issues about putting that in the title of the movie?
No, I've always loved the title. It's provocative to me. I hope on some level viewers will take that it's a metaphor for the larger 4-decade campaign as opposed to being directly related to the scientific device.
Just looking at you, I'm going to take a wild stab here that you were not old enough to actually have been alive when any of this happened.
Correct.
So I want to know how you heard about it in the first place.
I was following a lead on another story that I thought might be interesting. I had read in the Ottawa Citizen about what would have been the first LGBT retirement home at the time, and this was about 15 or 16 years ago. And I went and spoke to the gentleman who was behind that project, George Hartsgrove, who's still based in Ottawa. And through that conversation, he had told me that he was afraid that his business venture was going to fail because the same cohort of men and women that he was marketing to were the same men and women who had their sexuality driven underground during the Fruit Machine era. And I had never heard that term before. So we talked for another hour and had another coffee, and I just became completely committed to the story. I was wondering, you know, where all of these men and women were, what happened to their lives, and I was just committed to getting this film made.
John, I must confess that I had not heard about this story until I read about it in the pages of the Globe and Mail, thanks to you. How well known was it before you started writing about it?
Well, it wasn't known to me at all, that's for sure. I don't think it was all that well known at all, nor was the case of Everett Clippert, which actually got us from A to B. I had stumbled across the Clippert case. People who know LGBT issues well, especially the history of LGBT issues, would know about Clippert, but I hadn't. He was the man who was sentenced to life in prison in the 1960s. And the Supreme Court upheld that life sentence simply because he was gay, for no other reason than that. And it was the controversy over Clippert that caused Pierre Trudeau to say the state has no place in the bedrooms of the nation. I became fascinated by Clippert and wanted to tell his life story and what happened and how he managed to get himself sentenced to life in prison. Once we did that, and it became clear that there were other issues involved as well. Could we get a pardon, a posthumous pardon for Clippert? Could we get a pardon for all of the men who had been convicted of felonies just because they were gay up until legalization in 1969? Was the pardon even right? No, it shouldn't be a pardon. It should be expungement. There's nothing to pardon. And then that kind of moved in. Well, what else was going on at the time? Oh my God! Look at all the people. And there was a well-documented campaign to dismiss people from the public service, from the military. I kept walking into my editor's office and said, "You're not going to believe this, but here's what they were doing." In a way, for shame on the Globe and Mail and for shame on me that it took us so long to realize what was going on around us, especially back in those days. But finally, we sort of stumbled onto it and began writing stories about it.
Well, maybe you could help us with what seems like an obvious question. Why did the Canadian military and or government consider homosexuality to be a security threat back then?
The ostensible reason was that they were at risk of being blackmailed by the Russians. So after the Second World War, when the Cold War launched, there was a fear that people in the military and the public service, especially in foreign affairs, would be compromised, would be blackmailed, and would give up secrets. I don't believe, actually, that any of that was the real motivation. I think it was just a witch hunt and nothing but a witch hunt. But that was the ostensible reason for it.
Sarah, how much of the public service was, in fact, under observation on these criteria?
It was far sweeping. Every department was under scrutiny.
So we know the military?
Yes.
If you worked for the civil service in Ottawa?
Absolutely.
Even beyond?
Certainly Ottawa was the nucleus of the campaign, but
if
it
you're a
was...
university professor, for example, back then, would they
I'm
have been
not sure
in
if
that
it
net?
extended to universities, but it certainly extended to other government-funded agencies, Crown corporations, the CBC, the NFB.
Gotcha. Well, Patti, we know this extended to your life because we just saw you in that clip there. So let's tell a bit of your story here. When did you join the Canadian Forces?
I went in, I was actually in the Naval Reserves the summer after high school, so 1977. In 1979, I decided to go in and go full-time. I had done well in the reserves, decided to give it a go, and went in September of 79.
How far did you go?
Well, let's see, they started, I was called in the first time after I was, I'd been sent to Chatham, New Brunswick, and the first time I was called in by the SIU was in July of 1980.
What's SIU?
It's the Special Investigation Unit of the Military Police.
And they called you in and said what?
Started asking a lot of very personal questions. My involvement with another person on the base.
Was that against the rules?
Well, in my moral compass, yes, very much so. It was very personal.
No, I mean, was your relationship with somebody else on the base somehow against the protocol of the day?
Yes, it was something that you had to keep hidden. And we knew that. We were outed by somebody who had pretended. She came to us as a friend and was actually, came to my knowledge by something she said to me in passing, that she was actually an informant and had been the one that told on those of us on our base.
Was she actually a friend?
I knew her as a civilian when I was in high school. She was a friend of a girl that I played basketball with.
And she snitched on you?
Yes. And I had been warned when I first got there. The first night there, I saw her. I was happy, somebody I knew, brand new to the base. And I went out for drinks with her that night, went to the mess hall, and the next day at work, one of the master corporals came up to me and advised me to keep my distance from her, that she was bad news. And then the irony on that, a few months later, the same man who warned me to stay away from her stopped talking to me when the word got out.
When you got pulled aside for interrogation, a man or a woman doing it?
It was two.
Two men?
It was a man and a woman.
Oh, a man and a woman?
Yes.
How long did it last?
Oh, God, I can't really imagine. I don't remember too much details. It was probably at least 2 or 3 hours.
Can I guess it wasn't too much fun?
No, you were terrified. And the longer the questioning went on, the angrier I got, because I just knew it was wrong. And that's what I'd said. It's Canada. This just doesn't happen in Canada. We're not a third world country. We've always known for being more advanced, more open-minded. And it just, it shocked me to my core that this was even occurring, that it should even matter. Because the people that were being called in, and I found out later, because I met so many through this film, the vast majority of us were up for accelerated promotion. We were actually doing exceedingly well, each of us in our career paths.
John, you've heard Patti's story. How common or not was this kind of occurrence?
Very common. Thousands of people were investigated during the 1950s, 60s, 70s, right up until the late 1980s, and dismissed for disadvantageously employable due to homosexuality, I believe is the clause that was used. It was a common occurrence in the public service, in the military, and indeed the legalization of same-sex acts in 1969 almost seemed to spur them on to renewed prosecutorial efforts. There was an ethos that homosexuals were a threat. They weren't proper to the service. They were bad for morale, and it was best if we had nothing to do with them. This was the attitude of the Canadian government to homosexuals throughout the Canadian government and the public service, right up until I believe, and Sarah can correct me, I believe the last member of the military who was fired was in 1989.
1989. That's
Correct.
not that long ago in the grand scheme of things.
Recent history.
It is fairly recent history. John, one quick follow-up on that. How disadvantaged were people's careers after they were drummed out of the public service by doing this? In other words, were they able to somehow make a comeback in their careers in some other avenue, or did this truly derail many lives?
Well, I talked to a fair number of people, as did Sarah, of course, and it depended on the individual. Some people simply picked themselves up and dusted themselves off and went on with their career in other fields. Some people were traumatized by it, and there was deep psychological harm done. And there are people who are struggling to this day with relationships. There were people who had substance abuse issues. But even those who were not outwardly affected, I talked to one fellow who in the early 1960s was drummed out of the Department of External Affairs. And he was fine. He got a good job and had a good career. And outwardly, there seemed to be no real lasting harm. But when I talked to him, he was still angry because he'd wanted to be a diplomat. He wanted to be an ambassador. He wanted to serve his country. And his country had said to him in the 1960s, "You're disgusting. We want nothing to do with you. You can't serve us. In fact, you're a disgrace to us. And you're out of here. You're gone." And all those decades later, once we brought it back up and began talking about it again, he was clearly angry at what had been done to him.
Patti, again, I just met you, so I don't know. You're going to tell me. But the outward impression that you convey is that in spite of that, you have not let it ruin your life. You are strong and proud and moving on. Do you want to go beyond that?
Yes. Yes, I have moved on because I had to. But when I came out, I was so angry, and I held on to that for months because I knew it was a great injustice, and I felt powerless to do anything about it. But I did move on after going through a depression, and at that time, I didn't even realize what a depression was, and I realized years later that's what it was, and I'm sure it was because of the anger, because of the trauma I did go through. But I did move on, and I
Move on to what?
Move on to Bell Canada, where I worked. They hired me a total of 3 times. I had worked there before I joined the military. They hired me right back when I came back, and upon my move to Hamilton, they hired me there again.
Do you feel, though, that the career that you had originally wanted and presumably had, invested much of yourself into was denied you?
I think I could have really excelled in the military. I was well suited to it. But at the same time, when this started, I had a good look at my future. I was 20 years old. I had a good look at my future. I realized I was probably going to go deep, deep into the closet, or I was going to have to find a nice gay man to marry and play a game and look over my shoulder for the rest of my career. And I wasn't sure I was up to that. So when the choice came down, I admitted to them that I was a lesbian. I took all the blame in the relationship, and I saved her career, and she retired from the military. And given the chance, I would do it again.
What kinds of we heard about the 2 to 3 hour interrogation that Patti underwent. What other kinds of tactics did authorities of the day use in order to drum people out of the public service?
Well, basically, anything you could imagine a spy network would employ. Interrogation was certainly at its center, but wiretapping, lie detection devices, manipulation was also very pronounced. So the SIU officers would often say to the suspected homosexuals, if you tell us the truth, we will keep you in the military, which was not the case.
So in other words,
manipulation
if you fess up that you're gay, we'll keep you, but then you'd fess up that you were gay and they'd turf you.
Correct.
And they wanted names. They wanted not
Yes.
just you, they wanted names from other people, and so they would follow you as well. I was followed for 8 months,
Yes.
and they deferred my release date 3 times before they finally let me go, because I wouldn't give them up.
Yes.
John, this sounds like Stasi KGB treatment in Canada, for goodness sakes. We don't expect this in Canada.
No, but time has passed. And it wasn't, of course, just Canada. This was common practice in the United States and Great Britain. It was a part of a legacy of a time that, even though some of us are of great age, lived through it, we've tend to have forgotten about it. I mean, one of the things that I discovered as I began investigating and writing about these stories for the Globe was how much of this past I had myself forgotten. What it was like in the 1980s, during the AIDS crisis, AIDS epidemic, the stigma that was attached. You didn't, if you were in journalism, for example, come out of the closet. You didn't go around in newsrooms telling people you were gay. It was damaging to your career. I remember in the course of the research coming across an editorial from the Fredericton Gleaner. I think it was in 1990 or 1989 or 1990. And the Fredericton Gleaner's editorial said that homosexuality was a perversion. More than that, it was a threat to public health, and that people who had acquired AIDS should be placed in what were in fact concentration camps. They should be quarantined from the general public and not allowed, so that the threat can at least be minimized. That's a position that a respectable metropolitan newspaper was taking in Canada in 1990. Yes, 15 years later, we had same-sex marriage. Things came together or fell apart, depending on how you look at it, very, very quickly. But that's the situation that obtained at the time.
And John, just to sort of clarify on the history on this, when Pierre Trudeau did come out and make his comment about the state having no business in the bedrooms of the nation and decriminalized homosexuality in 1969, how much of this treatment stopped?
Oh, I don't think it stopped. No, not only did it not stop, it accelerated. There's good evidence that now that it was technically legal, not only did the military and the public service, the RCMP and the investigating agencies not lay off, they would double their efforts to try to find people in the public service and expel them. It was almost like it was a goad for them.
Well, we know, of course, that the Prime Minister of that day, his son is now the Prime Minister today, and he apologized last year for this purge. Let's play a snippet of that. Sheldon, go.
It is with shame and sorrow and deep regret for the things we have done that I stand here today and say we were wrong. We apologize. I am sorry. We are sorry.
John, how important was that?
I think for a lot of us it was tremendously important. I was there in the House when the Prime Minister said those words, and there were a lot of eyes that were not dry, both on the floor of the Commons and in the gallery as well, and in the press gallery too, to be honest. But more important, that apology came with legislation that expunges the criminal record of people who were convicted of simply of being gay, of having same-sex acts before decriminalization. And it came with the settlement of a class action lawsuit, the largest in the world of its kind, that offered redress to people who had been expelled from the military and the public service. Because remember, they didn't just lose their careers, they lost their pension opportunities, they lost future employment. And so those two things, the legislation and the settlement of the class action, led by lawyer Douglas Elliott, coupled with the apology itself, I think brought not complete, but some measure of closure for a lot of people.
And was this, John, the first time that any governmental institution in the nation's capital acknowledged what had transpired?
Other governments around the world have acknowledged and apologized for what they did to their military and public servants. Germany has done so. New Zealand, some states of Australia. There's been a limited apology in the case of Great Britain, but no government has come anywhere close to Canada in a comprehensive apology, in a comprehensive expungement of criminal records, and especially in the settlement of financial compensation for those who had been persecuted.
Patti, what did that apology mean to you?
It gave me closure that I didn't even realize that I still needed. But I thought it was quite fitting, as Pierre Trudeau was the Prime Minister when I was let go, and I thought it was quite fitting that his son would give the apology. And it gave me validation to know the acknowledgement that, yes, what you did was very wrong.
Parliament, from time to time, apologizes for previous misdeeds. And there are some people who think that's the wrong thing to do, that it's really not the business of today's politicians to apologize for the sins of their fathers and grandfathers. What's your view on that?
I think it's just to acknowledge that it was wrong. And yes, you can't change what happened in the past, but talk about it and try to make sure that it doesn't happen again.
Did you get some compensation?
Not yet. Not yet. It's yet to be decided what the final financial distribution will be. That to me is just kind of a cherry on top of the cake, really.
The people, Sarah, in your film, are they unanimous in their view of the significance of that apology?
No, and that surprised me. For many, it was very welcomed, and a long time coming. For some, up to 40 years. But for some others, no, it was a little too late. They weren't so much interested in the apology.
What did they expect? Oh, go ahead, John, yeah.
We should also add that there are those who believe that the apology needs to be extended, and I agree with them. There were people who were called found-ins, who were, police would raid bathhouses and charge men, and in one case, at least one case, women, with being found in a common body house. The courts later ruled that bathhouses were not body houses and that no crime had been committed and those charges should not have been laid. There have been apologies from the police, but there's never been, the federal government's apology does not yet extend to those people. There's no opportunity for those people to have their criminal records expunged. And the Liberals say it's a matter of administration, trust us, we'll look after it. But you know, on this issue, for some people, there's not a whole lot of trust.
Well, let me get persnickety with you here for a second, John. Some of those incidents, and I don't know if you're thinking of the raid on Yonge Street, 35, 36 years ago now, on the gay bathhouses on Yonge Street, that would have been something that the province would have been in charge of, and therefore, is it incumbent upon the province to offer an apology if they see fit to under those circumstances?
But the charges are criminal charges, and therefore it's an area of federal jurisdiction. Okay. So sure, the Toronto police might have done it, and they may have been encouraged by the Ontario government at the time. But it was a federal criminal charge, so it's properly within federal jurisdiction.
Gotcha. Good clarification. Sarah, people put their heart and soul into making a movie because they obviously want to change the world. I want to know how you want the world to be different after people see your film.
I think that if the film can contribute to the national dialogue around discrimination of the LGBTQ+ community, I will be happy. I've often said that the measure of success of this film for me really is how the survivors of the film perceive it, because my goal was always to tell a very authentic, very real capture of what they went through. So if they're happy with what I've done, then I will be happy as well.
Well, I should ask one sitting right beside you. Are you happy with it?
I am. Sarah and her crew were so generous, so kind, very empathetic, and they handled us very gently, guided us through the process. And it again, was healing. It opened up a lot of wounds, but at the same time, it was very healing. And to see it brought to life and to hear the other stories, what I went through was bad enough, but to hear the other stories, it was pretty horrific.
Did you have people that you approached, that you wanted to include in the documentary, and they just said, can't go there, too painful, not interested?
Absolutely, both on the survivor side, but also on the military and the RCMP side as well. We did try to include that part of the story within the documentary, but no one would come forward and commit to telling the story on camera.
Disappointed in that?
I was. I was very curious. I still am. I do respect the fact that they were also government employees, you know, tasked with carrying out a campaign. And I'm very curious how many of those officers, how many of the SIU officers in the military actually believed in what they were doing, or whether they simply were carrying out a job.
John, in our last minute, let me give it to you to give us a sense about what it's like to be gay in the public service today. How different is it? How much less discrimination, or is there still discrimination in the public service today if you're LGBTQ?
Well, certainly there's no formal discrimination at all. My colleague Gloria Galloway wrote a story not that long ago about the efforts that the senior ranks of the military make now to ensure that LGBTQ people are fully integrated into the service and are not in any way discriminated against because of their sexuality. That said, it is 2018, but there are always going to be people who don't want to serve with queers, and that's just part of life. You have to live with it.
Understood. I want to thank all three of you for coming on the program tonight. There's John Ibbitson in the nation's capital. He is the writer-at-large for the Globe and Mail. Brought this story to much of the nation's attention. We did not know it before John started writing, so thanks for that, John. Sarah Fodey is the, are you the writer and producer? Writer, director, producer? Director, producer?
Sure.
Yeah. All of the above for The Fruit Machine, a documentary that is must-see TV. And Patti Gray was a veteran with the Canadian Armed Forces, and we're grateful for your participation here tonight as well, Patti. Thank you all.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.